Alright, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This should be the final exam review for English 1A, or what we'll call C1000. Probably have the same material. I will say that I do have all of it in a Kahoot. And, it is all here. It's playable. I'll be using it tomorrow. The main difference is that I start, and they have like little flashcard games you can do with it to play. It's not really that. But I started with Malcolm, go over his life, and then after that I go into the other kind of questions, right? So it is organized a bit different, and I will go over that in class. But if you miss class or you want a good review, there are every question but basically two on here. A couple didn't fit, because I have to shorten them down. And then the essay question. And the essay question is just a reflection. So it is literally just kind of you've been asked to look at basically what write 3 paragraphs about how the class has augmented, expanded, or otherwise affected your exercise of critical thinking using at least 3 examples of literature, other work you've been exposed to during the semester. It could be, it could be, something from your lyrics and politics. It could be any video. It could be kind of the things that we introduced in the beginning class and talk about, have to do with the link between current events and the class, in our readings. How is, what we're reading, how does it relate to immigration policy or mass incarceration or police brutality or war in the military-industrial complex or indigenous genocide or diversity, equity, and inclusion and people's history and social justice and the 3 evils of racism, materialism, and militarism that Martin Luther King introduced. Really should put that on the final, but I'll do it at a different time. Anyway, Thoreau broke the law to protest the U.S. actions, Mexican-American War and Fugitive Slave Act. And there have been a lot of black scholars who are talking about the way in which Homeland Security and ICE are treating undocumented peoples, and likening it to the Fugitive Slave Act. The assumption of guilt, the lack of due process, all these kind of things. So just the terrorism that accompanies state mechanisms where they treat human beings like that. So he replaced Thoreau refused to pay for 6 years his taxes, his poll tax. Now, when this is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a really famous transcendentalist, American philosopher and scholar. Him and Thoreau are kind of the American scholars who created a kind of, you could argue, were one of the most pivotal figures in creating an American literature as opposed to a European literature and breaking with that. Really important, any which way, if you like him or you don't like him, you agree or don't. And honestly, I love Thoreau. Emerson has some opinions that I really much disagree with, because he did essentially believe in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant superiority, and I don't believe it at all. So that is Ralph Waldo Emerson, but what he meant about the Mexico poisoning us was that he felt that Polk was doing it to expand slavery into new territories, and so the evil of slavery would expand, and this was, and that's why it says that after that. It's not anything bad about Mexicans themselves. But anyway, okay, that's what I say. But then Thoreau was not racist, but Emerson was. Emerson, some of the other guys who are big heroes of literature, I disagree with their stances on Mexicans and what they said. And it is what it is. Thoreau was dope, though, and John Brown was dope, and Frederick Douglass. So, okay. The law will never make men free. It is men who have got to make the law free. That is Thoreau. Thoreau was, he got bars. Okay. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, right? He says, Martin Luther King says, that is our country. It is the U.S. government. And, he said that violence basically affects, the whole world, right? So, the U.S. government, he wasn't worried about the big threats of the Soviets or foreigners. He was afraid of our own problems and evils. So, I replaced the old image I have from the 13th. They quote Obama saying that America is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. And here's like the dark purple. That is the highest population rate per capita of imprisoning in the world, and that's us. That's us. China and Thailand and some other countries, Russia, come after us, but we are I think they're a little bit inaccurate about China, though. China actually has probably 2 million Uyghur in prison camps and Muslim Turks from Xinjiang. Anyway, it's a genocide. Look into it. One amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. That's the whole point of the 13th, the movie. According to the 13th, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for black men is 1 in 3. You see white men 1 in 17, Latino men 1 in 6. Okay, and then this is just an extra graphic of how race. I put a link. It's active if you want to do that. 1 in 3. As covered in the 13th, this is what they call the Southern strategy. It's how Nixon got a whole bunch of white Democrats to become Republicans because they were racist. This is why people say, it's kind of funny, they'll say, it's the party of Lincoln, the Republicans. Well, it's like, yeah, but it really hasn't been doing like anti-racist things since the 1870s. They sold out in the 1870s under Rutherford B. Hayes. Or was it Rutherford? Yeah, it was Rutherford B. Hayes. And he made a deal that he would withdraw federal troops if they would, or the Democrats made a deal with Republicans. If the Democrats would give him the presidency, he would withdraw federal troops and stop protecting black folks in the South, and that's what he did. Okay, segregation. This is the specific type of segregation called Jim Crow. You all know about Jim Crow laws. I just want to reiterate them. They were not run back until they weren't withdrawn until 1965, though in some ways they still kind of. So this is Emmett Till, right? Emmett Till. Emmett Till is massively important in American history. His murder, even though there were so many horrible murders like that. And the murderers all got off. So this is Birth of a Nation, the first movie shown in the White House. The heroes are the KKK. The Birth of a Nation, yeah. 1 in 5 Americans watched it. Lifetime for imprisonment, again, comparing white men to black men to Latino men. 1 in 17, 1 in 3, 1 in 6. Women just seem to commit less crimes than men. But you see, they're higher in women than men, like astronomically. For like 1 in 18 for black women, 1 in 45 for Latina women, while white women it's 1 in 111. So it's even a worse ratio. Right? I think I didn't do the math. That's you can correct me if I didn't. Okay, the term. So this is underdeveloped, right? Sorry. The term. So these developed and undeveloped terms, like, they're really biased terms, but they're ways of categorizing nations. The term Third World was coined in the 1950s and is part of an anti-colonialist analysis that explained the poverty of many of the world's regions as a legacy of their colonial past. And you also got this thing called like First World, and that's the capitalist, quote-unquote, free world, right? Developed nations. Western Europe, the United States, Japan. And then you have the second world, and those are those nations that are considered developed or developing, but they're communist, and they're under the communist kind of dichotomy between. And then the third world was non-aligned. It was part of a non-aligned movement. So as a movement, it was a thing where they're like, we're not going to go with the Soviet Union and the communists 100%. We're not going with the capitalists 100%. We're going to be in the middle. And it was a political, and it influenced Malcolm and a lot of people, this idea of looking out for the interests of your own people. But now when we say third world, it means just basically somewhere that's poor, somewhere there's been colonization, somewhere that, they're suffering, and so, so poverty of many of the world's regions. They associate it with poverty of third world. All kinds of debate about these kind of terms. Walter Rodney was from Guyana. He was actually assassinated in Jamaica for his politics. He's an amazing dude. How Europe underdeveloped Africa. So you're talking about developed and undeveloped countries, and he's talking about, well, the reason why they're quote-unquote underdeveloped is because of exploitation and colonization. So it's a really important kind of book and concept, because you can look at it. It's very much like The Open Veins of Latin America by the Uruguayan scholar Eduardo Galeano. Really amazing. Sorry, somehow I stopped recording, so I've been talking. Okay. How Europe underdeveloped Africa, showing you Galeano. So during the 1960s, in the context of anti-colonial revolutions abroad, and African Americans and Native Americans organizing at home, a lot of this was set off really in the wake of Malcolm, kind of being a spearhead for talking about a lot of issues and bringing them together. And people saw him in the 60s. He's murdered 65, 66. Black Panthers are formed up in Oakland. And they affect the Chicano movement, and they affect the American Indian movement, where you have Brown Berets and other Chicano organizations founding in LA and other places. And then you have in Minneapolis, Minnesota, you have the American Indian movement. And a lot of those dudes are out of prison, Native people's out of prison, because they're in prison more than even black folk. Higher rates, because the reservations were prisons already. It's colonization. It's how the colonized people are treated. And they form all these organizations. They do all this activism. So, African Americans, Native Americans, a Chicano movement, and a Puerto Rican or Boricua movement also emerged in the U.S. These people identified with the indigenous peoples of their homelands. They used the concept of internal colonization because Puerto Ricans have been colonized and never let go, never let to have really self-rule, never their land is exploited horribly sometimes by the U.S. military. If you look at the island of Vieques and all these other places, and many, you guys know about the Mexican-American War and the taking of land that was claimed by Mexico, that included land where Mexicans lived. Not just, there was land that indigenous people lived, that was, by right, I think, indigenous people's land, and then there was land that Mexican lives that was taken from them. And it's a giant topic, but they use the concepts of internal colonization and analyze the historic situation in the U.S. as that of colonized minorities rather than immigrants. So you see many activists, Latino activists, indigeneity is very central to their identity. Okay, so this is an image for the Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War in 69 and 70. We had tens of thousands in the street of L.A. because 50% of the casualties were black and Latino, even though black and Latinos only made up 18% of the population in Vietnam. And it's important to know that. They don't tell you about this, which is one of the most giant kind of Chicano protests that existed, man. And later we'll talk about. I mentioned it before, the killing of one of the greatest, Ruben Salazar, one of the greatest Chicano bilingual journalists for the LA Times and also on television, who they think was killed for his reporting on issues that affect Latinos. So this is an easy one. The U.S. border with Mexico extends for nearly 2,000 miles and is the longest meeting point between a rich and a poor country in the world. And this has an art display on the bottom. These are toe tags that show how many, just like the crosses here on the border. These are toe tags that show, how many people have died and where they've died on the border, just with Arizona, right? You can see Phoenix and Tucson labeled there. 17. The U.S. Border Patrol has recorded over. Now here I put 7,000 migrant deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border between the fiscal 1998 and 2000, between those years. And at that time, 2020 was the deadliest year on record with 227 recorded deaths. Now, they've updated that number for that time to 7,500. Now they're saying in 25 years, so if you add, what is it? That's 22 years. So you add 3 years, there's been 9,000 deaths. I'm going to still keep that 98 to 2020, 7,000 deaths, and that's from the Border Patrol itself, so that means it's actually a very low estimation. It's actually like the lowest you can verify and still really prove that you did it, or that's happened, 7,000. It's an enormous amount of people, mostly women and children, mostly poor people, dying of dehydration and heat exhaustion, other things. It's really horrible. And it does remind me kind of the way they're counting is kind of like in Palestine with the Israeli genocide, the Zionist genocide against the indigenous Palestinian people in Gaza. The population was 2.2 million before the genocide. The official death toll is about 60,000, about 20,000 children. And these are verified deaths. We know the people there. It's authenticated. And the thing is, there are over 377,000 people missing. So if you look at the deaths, they probably are more around over 400,000, maybe more. Almost a fourth or a fifth of the population has been killed. They're being starved right now. They go for food. They ambush them and shoot them. It's basic news stories you can find. It's the sickest stuff you can find in history until you go and look at indigenous genocide. But the thing is, same as kind of thing with the statistics. So we have 7,000 verified bodies. There's probably thousands more. And this is why just militarizing the border doesn't work. We need better immigration policy. Okay, so I didn't show Harvest of Empire in summer. I usually do in my other classes. Because Harvest of Empire says, like, a lot of the reasons that you have immigrants coming to the United States is because of U.S. interventionism and violence in their homeland. And so, especially even in Central America, which Trump last time was demonizing the Central American caravans, all that kind of stuff. Well, why are they coming here? Well, from Guatemala, for example. We overthrew the CIA in 1953, overthrew the government of Iran. And they put in a repressive king. It was a kind of fake king. His dad, foreign powers made him king. He wasn't like a long lineage, the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. And they trained his intelligence agency in the Savak, and he was just brutal against his own people, and he got overthrown in 1979. And religious fundamentalists took over that revolution. It was a joint revolution with lots of people. And I don't particularly like that government, but it's not for me to say. It's for the people there. And bombing and killing people in a nation usually actually doesn't really destabilize the government. It usually reinforces them if they're, especially if they're kind of brutal. And that government is kind of brutal in some ways. I don't agree with it. They have a much higher rate of women in STEM and graduating as engineers than Americans. They're great education system. The Persians, the Iranians are they're ancient civilization with ancient education, literary traditions, rarely paralleled in the annals of humankind, whatever. Okay, so 53 overthrew the government of Iran. So the CIA started to think we could do that everywhere. So 54, they overthrew the government of Guatemala. And Arbenz was he was trying to institute reform, give land back to the peasants and the indigenous, and that pissed off United Fruit, which is now Chiquita Banana. You should look up Banana Republics. You should look up, some videos and this stuff. This stuff is insane. So this chapter creates linkages between the U.S. support of the Arbenz overthrow and the beginning of a 36-year-long civil war that left 200,000 dead, mostly indigenous people. And it's Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. All those countries went through this. And a lot of my students that I've taught from Guatemala were actually indigenous Mayans, Canhubal people, and not all of them even spoke Spanish. There was no resources for them. So this is Diego Rivera, that great Mexican artist, the husband of Frida Kahlo, and these are the CIA and secret Secretary of Defense, the Dulles brothers, John and Alan Dulles, and they were lawyers and investors in Chiquita Banana or United Fruit, and they were they just kept doing that. And this is who suffered. Rigoberta Menchú won the Nobel Prize for fighting for indigenous rights in Guatemala. She has a couple books. I have her autobiography. Father was murdered, kind of at the back of the U.S. government. Harvest Empire is good. I wish I could show it, but part of this, they're talking about Manifest Destiny, the U.S.-Mexico War, which were tied, and how many people. During the Great Depression, President Hoover deported 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and then, during World War II, he, they brought them back for the Bracero program, and then they told them they tried to put them back again, right? I want to introduce you, if nothing else, to all these things. This is an image of a local freedom fighter, man, who went through it. And he's from, all the parts of this story, from the fact, he's from Lemoore, and also that it was Mexico City and the tremendous violence of the state in Mexico City against student protesters, against people wanting things to be better there. It's insane. It's a beautiful image, and there's these beautiful images, historians that are. So, Bismillah, something is happening with this recording that I just recorded all this stuff and it cut it off, which is frustrating. So I left off with Tommy Smith, and Tommy Smith and John Carlos got a whole critique of the world, much like Malcolm, worth checking out. And he suffered a lot of racism in the Valley, man, because it's a racist, and not just racist, it's like kind of, this is one of the poorest areas in the whole country, the Central Valley, the most wealth, inequity and inequality in almost the whole country. Okay. So, some of the many factors behind Central American migration include the long-term impact of wars and U.S. military involvement in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras in the 1980s, the neoliberal violence that followed the peace agreements in the two countries, especially in 2009. The U.S. under Obama tried to overthrow the government in Honduras, the U.S. supported coup. Millions of undocumented parents from these countries in the U.S. whose children are desperate to unite with them. The horrific levels of gang violence, homicide, and drug-related crime. And the impact of drought and food security on these countries, like all this stuff. The U.S. did a lot of stuff in Central and South America. This is 56 military interventions in Latin America. Everybody should know some have some point of reference for a lot of these. I mean, everybody should. We should know what our government does. And there's a lot more than this. They all have histories in each of these. I could talk about all of them. We're given time, but I won't. We got to get through this. Okay. And I want to make it 40 minutes or less. According to Chomsky, in relation to the 14th Amendment, citizenship was particularly denied to Asians by 1882. They were all prevented from coming to the U.S. at all. Chinese people were not permitted to naturalize until 1943 because it helped out with World War II against the Japanese. So, this is the Chinese must go. This stuff was really common in California. California had a population of Chinese, after the gold rush, that was so big it was like 10% of the population. And they worked in the gold mines, and then they built the railroads. They never took pictures of them. You guys probably know Transcontinental Railroad, 1869, and the joining, and all this stuff. Didn't take any pictures of the Chinese who did the hard work. And they did a lot of stuff in farm labor, and they were exploited on a lot of levels. I mean, the only people who got permits to come were often the heads of the triads, the people working for the triad, not the head, but the main people who were often human trafficking for the triads. So remembering 1882, fighting for civil rights in the shadow of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese excluded, celebrating it, kicking them out. It's really important to California history. Okay. Most recently, states have established, this is from Luis Rodriguez's book, right? The article we read, the essay, from our land to our land. Most recently, states have established laws against brown-skinned, undocumented migrants, including in 2010 when outlawed Arizona teachings in ethnic history and culture in response to a high school Mexican-American studies program. Today, Salvadorans and other Central Americans, as well as Haitians, once permitted to remain in the U.S., have lost their temporary protected status. With a swipe of the pen, they become undocumented again. And there's that travesty on the border where human beings are treated like animals. And this is an example of how they're being treated like animals, and there's a link. Those are Haitians and being whipped. And again, the taking of temporary protected status was just taken from Cubans and Haitians and Venezuelans, like 500,000, right? A couple weeks ago. And all of a sudden, hey, you're no longer legal here, right? You should self-deport. My friends who are Haitians got those letters months ago, asking them to do that. Mexicans have been widely discriminated against and attacked for some 170 years since the U.S. invasion of Mexico that ended in 1848. And Mexicans were more frequently lynched than any group outside African Americans since that war. This fate befell, they say, upwards of 1,000 people, mostly in Texas. That's a lynching from Santa Cruz, California, 1877. These are other Mexican lynchings. There are some links. This one goes over them. There are some sources talking about East Texas and the lynchings and murders primarily by Texas Rangers that would make the numbers up there with black folks. And I've read them. Pretty disturbing. About 7,000. That's lynched. So Mexicans were also the most subject to segregations after blacks. They won court cases to help end school segregation, like Mendez versus Westminster in 1947. In 1930s, during the Great Depression, around 1 million Mexicans were repatriated back to Mexico, even though 60% were citizens. They are also like indigenous people, black people, Mexican and Latino people are killed at a higher rate, incarcerated at a higher rate than white people. And that has remained consistent for decades. Here's a whole bunch of images. That's Thurgood Marshall, who argued both Sylvia Mendez, that's Sylvia Mendez, and for Brown versus Board of Education. So they were both 39, with beautiful smiles there. Malcolm and Martin, people who were brave enough to tell the truth and die for telling the truth. And all the truth, and they still don't teach you. In the last period of his life, this is from the Evolution of Malcolm X, Malcolm, he develops an anti-capitalist analysis of economics at home and globally, right? It's him with Fidel Castro, who had overthrown, the Cuban mafia-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in 1959. And he met with Che Guevara as well, the Argentine doctor and revolutionary. So he's anti-capitalist, and doesn't mean small-level capitalist. He means big corporate, running things and abusing, the people. Um, you can't have capitalism without racism. There's this whole analysis that Malcolm had of capitalism and racism, because Euro-American capitalism was founded on the taking of indigenous land and slavery and the underdevelopment of Africa. First chapter of Malcolm X is Nightmare, right? Malcolm's father and mother they work with the Marcus Garvey under his UNIA movement. Malcolm was born Omaha, Nebraska in 1925, and I want to keep showing people that that clan that threatened his mother was the same clan that had 25,000 people marching in the street of another city in Lincoln, not Omaha, though the KKK was giant in Omaha too. 25,000 people, and and again, like Fresno had at the Fresno Fair for a week in 1925, a whole week of KKK activities with 50,000 people coming to support the KKK. So, this is like when we talk about birth of a nation and a second rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, and with greater hatred for more people, more un-American, more anybody who's not white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. It's a really important movement. And the consequences of that movement are still with us in a lot of ways that people don't like to acknowledge. Okay, what happened here? Okay. Still recording, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so there is Louise Little, Malcolm's mother, and she was originally from Grenada, which is, British colonized island. And she met Malcolm's dad in Canada, actually. So she's from Grenada. Like Jamaica, they have a similar kind of accent, if that makes sense to you. According to the autobiography, Malcolm's father is killed. He's murdered by white supremacists in 1931. Malcolm's 6, right? After the murder of her husband, she goes through all kinds of stuff, man. She got 8 kids, barely getting by. And, she gets pregnant with her 8th child. And the man who she got pregnant from jilts her, leaves, and she has a mental breakdown. But also, they've been trying to wait for her to lose her stuff and then pounce on it, and it's not really looking at the mental health system at the time, and really, should she have stayed in that system? Probably not. It was not the best way, and it impacts Malcolm, right? In a lot of ways, and how he sees the system. And the system, again, in chapter 2, when he's trying to assimilate, right? Mascot, being a lawyer was no realistic goal for an N-word. That's what his teacher tells him, right? 8th grade. He doesn't leave right away, but he drops out of school. He won't go back to school after 8th grade. By the time he's 15, he moves to, he had visited Boston to see his sister. Now he moves to Boston to live with his sister. He meets, during the chapter, Homeboy. He meets Malcolm Jarvis, a shorty. He's tall. He's like 6'4", 6'5" at 15. He starts to fill out a bit so he can pretend, he can act like he's an older person and hustle. And so that's 3 and 4 are set, in Harlem. In Boston. So, Homeboy, he meets Malcolm Jarvis. There's Malcolm Jarvis, just an image so you can kind of remember. Malcolm was 15 in 1940 when he bought his first zoot suit, right? And he's part of that whole movement, which is real interesting because it's like something that kind of combined Black, Latino, and Filipino cultures. Conk is a type of straightening of your hair, right? A hairstyle that imitates white hairstyles, and Malcolm has a lot to say about all those things, right? So this is the real Sophia. She was an Armenian American, our sister, and there is them at that time. So unfortunately, Laura, not her real name, she ends up on drugs and getting pimped out. Okay, Malcolm's thug life proper really takes off when he goes to Harlem, and when you look at chapters, 5, Harlemite, Detroit Red, Hustler, and Trapped, it covers what his life before he goes to prison. This is something I wish they would have shown in every movie because it's a dope scene. Why does Malcolm tell a psychiatrist that he wants to lead Southern blacks in murdering, killing Southern whites? There's my AI image for it. Because it's to avoid the draft. He wants to avoid the draft. He's not stupid. Even Shorty's like, I ain't got nothing, no stake in the World War II. Whitey wants to go to war. Let Whitey fight it. That's how Malcolm Jarvis even takes it. Okay, so unlike all the film adaptation I've ever seen of Malcolm's life, they never talk about the fact he just went to go return a stolen watch, and then he pays for it. He gets arrested, and there's a whole scene. Stolen watch, the jewelry store owner, blah, blah, blah. The watch's owner had reported it. He gets in trouble. And that's why he got locked up. But, that's also why they weren't hard on him initially when they were beating people in the other room, In 1946, he's sentenced to 8 to 10 years for armed robbery. He served 6.5 years in Charleston, Massachusetts State Prison and Norfolk Prison Colony. He was 21. Went into prison. Okay, so he spends 2 years in Charleston State Prison. Then he spends 2 years in Norfolk Prison Colony. That's when he converts to Islam. And then he won't, they're kind of afraid of him, influencing other prisoners. They say he won't take a vaccination, and so they send him back to Charleston State Prison. I'm sorry, yeah, Charleston State Prison for 2 more years, and that's where he's released from there. So Malcolm's accomplices are arrested too. So Shorty, Sophia, and her sister. Basically they are locked up for their relationship with middle-class white women. It's not because of their crimes themselves, right? Those 8 to 10, 14 counts of 8 to 10 years all to be run concurrently. In 1848 or 49, many of Malcolm's siblings, following many of his siblings' conversions, Malcolm converts to the Nation of Islam while in prison. Right? He's in prison. He's in the Norfolk Prison Colony. In 1953, after he gets out, he receives his X, right, the variable of what it was. X stands for what his slave name, his name would have been before enslavement. He changes his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X and becomes assistant minister of Nation of Islam's Detroit Temple. So Little, like Clay for Cassius Clay, who became Muhammad Ali, was a slave name. So in the late 50s, after becoming national spokesman, in 59 to be specific, Malcolm X travels to the Middle East and Africa and starts to see the real African-American struggle in a larger global context, that of global struggles against white power structures. Now, he is thinking about South America, Asia, Europe, everywhere. But he does travel to the Middle East and Africa. In 1963, in November of 1963, the Nation of Islam orders Malcolm to be silent, allegedly because of remarks concerning Kennedy's assassination. In 1964, in April, Malcolm completes the Hajj, right? He gets the title of Haji, the one who goes on Hajj. And this is a really important, pillar of Islam that he fulfills. Malcolm leaves Mecca, Medina on April 13th, and he holds a press conference upon his return on May 21st, but he goes back. He goes back overseas, 18 weeks overseas. So the thing is, he completes his Hajj. He talks about the spiritual journey in the holy city of Mecca, and this is also about why this little quote here was about, why he changed from being a black nationalist, and he's like, well, the Algerians had fought for over 100 years, 145 years, something like that, to get freedom for themselves, and he respected it. Just 1 million people died in that fight, and Malcolm respected them, and the guy goes, look, if you say you're a black nationalist, where does that leave me? You know. Now Malcolm says he's white. He's not white. He is Amazigh. He is Berber. You know, they're indigenous people of North Africa, and Arabs mixed with them, and other people mixed with them, and they went to Sicily and southern Italy, and there's a whole mix of people, or whatever. But saying he's white is simplistic. But he's saying, well, you know, he's not black. He's African. He's not black. So he's saying, where does it leave me? And so, you know, he says, you know, he was alienating true revolutionaries, and he's like, yeah, that's not right. Anyway, and so Malcolm changes his philosophy to Pan-Africanism at that point, where he's talking about Africa in a more general way, and all the peoples of Africa in the diaspora. Anyway, the Hajj is the answer. So a week before he's murdered, right? He's murdered February 21st, and a week before he's murdered, his house on Valentine's Day in 1965, his house is firebombed. So the guy who shot Malcolm with a shotgun, and many people are kind of assert this, was a dude named William Bradley, ex-Green Beret. You can watch Who Killed Malcolm X or read several later. I was The Dead Are Arising. Do I have that book right here? Yeah, this book here. I would highly recommend this. The Dead Are Arising. It's kind of big, but it's, you know, there's an audiobook by Les Payne, finished by his daughter Tamara Payne. And this is the guy, you know, he hit out and knew. The assassins who killed Malcolm, some of them had government ties. William Bradley definitely did, because he was a soldier, a special forces guy. They lived, only one of them went to prison, of the 4 or 5 shooters. And this guy lived until 2018 in Newark. So, you know, the other guy, Talmadge Hayer, he was a shooter, and he went to prison. Thomas Johnson and Norman Butler weren't there, were at other places, verified, but they went to prison for a couple of decades for a crime they didn't commit. So, February 25th, 1965, this is how they put Malcolm on display. Muslims generally do that. We don't do that. It's not our tradition, but it wasn't Muslims running things, and when Muslims got running things, then we prayed. That's them praying, the funeral prayer over him, and the burial. There was a Sudani sheikh who did that, you know, from Sudan. Okay, John Brown. John Brown, one of my heroes in 2nd grade. I love Malcolm. I love John Brown. And here is an image of John Brown kissing a baby, black baby, before his execution. So John Brown, be like John Brown. This is actually the quotes from Malcolm from some speeches he wrote, and even he said something about him in the autobiography. You know, he doesn't trust Western white liberals. This is really a lot of writing, and all it is, I have the numbers, you know, because I hope you'll able to understand. But before, in California, the last week, we're going to watch some videos on California genocide and indigenous genocide. There's two videos that go over California history. You know, the mission system, there are like 350,000 indigenous people in California before the mission system. You know, Frau Junipero Serra, 1769, he starts building those up the coast of Alto California, right? Because they're already in Baja, right? The Mexican part, right now it's the Mexican part. And like, a lot of indigenous people fight against it. They don't want it, but they get established, and they're basically, those missions are concentration camps, and they half the population of native peoples. So there are, basically, you know, before 350,000, and after there are 150,000. And by 1848, when you have the, you know, Sutter's Mill, who also, he had an army of enslaved indigenous people, including a harem of 25 indigenous women and girls, right? That whole murdered and missing indigenous girls, women and girls, hashtag MMIW, and sometimes MWG. It's worth watching because it's part of colonization that goes back really to Columbus, but also through the Spaniards, through the Anglos who came to California. Anyway, so this book here, American Genocide, is one of the most meticulously detailed and documented sources that makes the argument that it was a genocide here in California, and by Benjamin Madley. Clearest case of genocide in the history of the American frontier. But it goes from 150,000 in California, 150,000 in 1848 to 30,000 by 1876. Right. So, and then the Yocut. I'll have another question. They were 70,000 within 30 years. They were 600. Just so we know how this is this evil-looking man, right? The first governor of California, Peter Burnett, who said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Right? Here are some of the different tribes, and where they lived. You can see it says Yocut here. Let's say Paiute and Miwok and Mono, etc. Here's the chart. But all you have to do is hit genocide here. Right? So I put my land acknowledgement here, right? I have in the syllabus. And it's by 1880, after the genocide, the indigenous population of the Central Valley was only 600. And I put 15 points because I want you to remember this, man. Nobody talks about it. They act like it doesn't matter. If you want to see that, like for the Techi, the Yocut, their website, it goes over this kind of history, right? So there's a link. This is Malcolm with Kwame Nkrumah at the UN in the United States. He was the first free ruler of Ghana, and really an iconic figure in their revolutions. Travels of Malcolm X. Some of the places he traveled: Saudi Arabia, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, Algeria, Tanzania, Kenya, Liberia, Senegal, Morocco, Lebanon, Kuwait, UAE, Gaza, France, England. So this is 64. Like, he went 18 weeks. He spent, after a while in America, I returned abroad. This time I spent 18 weeks in the Middle East and Africa. And he talks about, all these different rulers, including Kwame Nkrumah of Africa, Sekou Touré, Jomo Kenyatta, etc., etc. So this is 18 in Ghana. And you can read his diary about that. So really important. In 64, right after Hajj, one of the places he goes is Gaza. This was not his first time to Palestine, being in Jerusalem in 1959. But it's really impactful. He went to the refugee camps there, and he met with leaders, and he saw the dire conditions of the camp and the stories where the Israelis had massacred and pushed them out through terrorism, through massacres entire villages. When they massacred like Deir Yassin and other ones, which was a model, like they raped, they murdered, they cut the bellies of pregnant women and ripped the fetuses out, and they publicized it. So this is well documented because they tried to say that, hey, Palestinians, you want to be indigenous people staying in your own home? Well, we as white colonizing, Zionists, this is what we're going to. So they loud speakers, they said, so in Deir Yassin, so everywhere. And so that they were going to massacre. If you stayed at home and you tried to fight, or you just tried to stay home and non-violently resisted, you'd be, killed, raped, mutilated. Your babies, everyone, children, women, everyone would be killed. And so there were refugees since 1948, from the war that established Israel in 1948, which was based on ethnic cleansing of white colonizers of an indigenous population. But their president said, we will do so to the indigenous population of Palestine as the white man did to the red man in the Americas. But we never study that, right? But it's worth studying. Really worth studying. So, 2 weeks after visiting Gaza and Palestine after Hajj, he penned an influential piece called Zionist Logic in the Egyptian Gazette. In it, he articulated a deep understanding of the Zionist project, its colonial roots, and its divisive role in anti-imperialist movements of Africa and Asia. The essay warned African nations about Israel's so-called aid and its underlying neo-imperialist motives. Malcolm wrote, the ever-scheming European imperialists wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate and sow seeds of dissension among African leaders, and also divide Africans against the Asians. And, this is a really insightful thing. He understood colonization and Zionism, and he spoke out against it. He didn't just understand it. And there's a lot of Zionism was this time of colonialism, which it was. It's the last really kind of actively ongoing colonial endeavor where there's still these white colonizers, primarily white. They got some lackeys who were from the Middle East or from Africa, like some of the Ethiopian falashas and some Arabized Jews. But the Arabized Jews, a lot of them are really not with it. They're treated as second class, and then the Ethiopian ones are treated like third class. And you basically have fourth class for the Arabs who are not Jewish, who are Christian or Muslim. And they hate the Christians more than the Muslims because of their beliefs. Anyway, Malcolm's travels to Sudan and Africa were not mere footnotes in his life, but pivotal chapters in his evolution as a global thinker. So in Sudan, his experiences enriched his understanding of intersectionality in the fight for liberation, highlighting the interconnectedness of struggles across borders and cultures. In Sudan, he saw the possibility of unity amongst black people beyond American shores, exploring the way in which the fight for justice was a shared human endeavor. The hospitality and faith that he witnessed deeply influenced his understanding of Islam as a faith that shatters all systems of oppression. In Gaza or Palestine, he recognized the shared plight of those under colonial rule, understanding that true freedom could not be achieved in isolation. His reflections on the anti-colonial struggle underscored a profound realization that the fight for justice transcends racial, ethnic, and national lines, calling for solidarity amongst all oppressed people. So Zinn with his sheikh from Sudan. This is a really important saying. If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Watch out for that, man. So this is an image I made. It took so many times to get this right. All these images, it takes forever. But I like it. It doesn't exactly look like him, but it's okay. It's, I don't know if you guys... They put Egypt to the west of Sudan. I'm going to freaking go... Okay. Egypt is north of Sudan, you guys. Anyway. Now, this is a really long quote from Martin Luther King. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the idea that the original American was... Well, they changed the quote, I think. Oh, okay. The doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Right? Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We were perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for the shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalt it. So, Malcolm X is straight quoting Martin Luther King, and it's beautiful. It's like this beautiful confluence of these two streams of ideas coming together, and then King carries that torch in his own way. So, I have to amend this because I don't have you didn't read They Take Jobs in 20 Arguments about Immigration. I haven't amended it for summer yet, but 3 paragraphs explain how this class has augmented, expanded, or otherwise affected your exercise of critical thinking, using at least 3 examples of literature or other works you have been exposed to during the semester. Whatever is most compelling to you, right? And this is not a research paper. You can write it ahead of time and post it. It is 100 points. Please do it. 3 paragraphs. 3 for full credit. 100 points, 3 paragraphs. And you could write about songs that you wrote about and how important they are and anything. All right. It's always great working with my students in my classes. It's extremely rewarding. and I just want to thank you and wish you well. Please turn in everything as soon as you can, and hopefully you do really well in this in the class. I really don't want anybody to fail, and so please do well. All right, much love. Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum.